The 1948 Dodge B-Series has long been celebrated as one of the most charismatic and mechanically honest American pickups of the post-war era. Its design emerged at a time when the United States was transitioning from wartime production to a booming consumer economy, and Dodge wanted a truck that symbolized strength, durability, and civilian prosperity. For that reason, the official story has always portrayed the B-Series as a nearly flawless machine, rugged, simple, dependable, a vehicle for farmers, small businesses, and ambitious workers who needed a trustworthy tool. But behind the shiny brochures, the smiling advertisements, and the mythology built by collectors over the decades, there were several flaws that few dared to mention openly. These were not catastrophic failures that sent trucks to the scrapyard overnight, but subtle engineering compromises, overlooked design weaknesses, and chronic mechanical issues that Dodge never made a point to highlight. They were the kinds of defects that owners learned about only after months or years of hard use, yet they became so common that an entire underground community of mechanics, drivers, and enthusiasts developed unspoken rules about how to live with a B-Series. Understanding these flaws does not diminish the cultural value of the truck. Instead, it brings a more realistic and historically interesting portrait of what the Dodge B-Series really was beneath its reputation, a characterful machine, but far from perfect. The first major issue that Dodge quietly avoided discussing was the overheating tendency of the Flathead 6 when placed under continuous heavy load. On paper, the engine seemed indestructible. Dodge Flatheads had a reputation for robust cast-iron durability, low revving power delivery, and the kind of simplicity that allowed even inexperienced owners to perform shade tree repairs. What Dodge never openly admitted, however, was that the cooling system on early B-Series models was right on the edge of adequacy. The radiator was sized for normal usage rather than extreme conditions, and as a result, trucks used for towing, long uphill climbs, or extended low-speed work frequently suffered from temperature spikes. Many owners in hotter climates, especially in the American Southwest and parts of Texas and New Mexico, quickly discovered that the B-Series needed aftermarket help, larger radiators, auxiliary fans, or modified shrouds, if one wanted to avoid the dreaded simmering boilover. Dodge engineers knew that wartime production constraints had affected component availability, and they also knew that their trucks were being sold as dependable workhorses in regions where heat was an everyday enemy. Yet the company avoided highlighting this weakness, preferring to emphasize durability while quietly hoping that most buyers would never push their trucks to the limits. The problem became more evident as the trucks aged and as farm owners or small businesses attempted to use them for increasingly demanding tasks. A significant number of field reports from the late 1940s and early 1950s show that overheating was not an isolated issue but a systemic byproduct of design choices made under the pressure of post-war manufacturing realities. Some mechanics jokingly referred to the B-Series as a radiator babysitter, meaning that the temperature gauge demanded constant attention on hot summer days. Another flaw that enthusiasts rarely mention, mainly because acknowledging it feels like criticizing a beloved classic, was the structural weakness around the cab mounts and floor pans. These trucks were built in an era when salt use on winter roads was expanding rapidly, and Dodge, like most manufacturers of the time, had not yet fully understood the long-term corrosive impact on certain sheet metal thicknesses. While the frame itself was robust, the cab structure was surprisingly vulnerable. Moisture accumulation under floor mats, combined with inadequate drainage channels, created a perfect breeding ground for rust. In many regions, especially the Midwest and Northeast, it was common for B-Series owners to discover soft spots in the floor within just a few years of use. Dodge dealerships often attributed this to climate rather than design, sidestepping blame by insisting that customers simply needed to maintain their trucks more aggressively. But the truth is that the metal gauge used in the floors and lower cab channels was thinner than ideal, and the design included several pockets where debris, mud, and moisture collected without any easy escape. Over time, the damage spread to door sills, rocker areas, and cab supports, forcing owners to improvise repairs or welding patches just to remain roadworthy. Many restorers today consider the B-Series one of the most challenging Dodge pickups to bring back to factory condition precisely because of these rust-prone structural weaknesses. Collectors adore these trucks, Yet behind closed doors they acknowledge that finding an original B-Series cab that has not suffered severe corrosion is extremely rare. One of the most controversial and least discussed defects of the Dodge B-Series was the steering system, which, even when new, felt vague, heavy, and inconsistent. Marketing materials described it as solid and confident, but owners often described another experience entirely. The manual steering box of the late 1940s Dodge trucks suffered from excessive play, a condition that worsened quickly as the components wore down. The kingpins required frequent lubrication, and if neglected for even a short time, the truck would begin to wander on the road. Combined with the bias-ply tires of the era, the B-Series could be exhausting to drive over long distances, particularly on highways where maintaining a straight line demanded constant small corrections. Mechanics of the time routinely recommended more frequent greasing intervals than Dodge officially published because they saw how quickly the steering performance deteriorated with real-world use. Many owners accepted that it's just how old trucks are, but the truth is that competing manufacturers like Ford and Chevrolet offered trucks with more predictable steering behavior. Dodge quietly updated some steering components in later years, but they never publicly framed these changes as corrective measures. Instead, they framed them as natural improvements. For those who drove these trucks daily, especially delivery drivers navigating tight urban streets, the steering effort could become a literal physical burden. Stories exist of drivers finishing a full shift with sore shoulders simply because maneuvering a loaded B-Series at low speed required significant muscle. While enthusiasts today romanticize the feeling of old-school manual steering, the people who used these trucks for real, demanding work often viewed the steering system as one of its most persistent frustrations. A fourth defect, less visible but deeply impactful for owners, involved the gearbox. Dodge marketed the B-Series transmission as rugged and simple, ideal for repeated heavy-duty cycles. But the experience of many owners contradicted this polished narrative. The non-synchronized first gear was already typical for trucks of the time, but the B-Series gearbox had a notorious habit of developing gear whine and difficulty engaging gears after a relatively low number of miles. This noise was not just an annoyance, it often signaled premature wear of the gears or bearings. Shifting could also feel notchy and resistant, requiring a careful double-clutching technique to avoid grinding. Many drivers quickly learned that rushing shifts was a guaranteed way to damage the transmission, and Dodge service departments frequently received complaints. But instead of acknowledging a design flaw, the company suggested that drivers simply needed proper shifting technique, subtly placing the blame on users instead of engineering limitations. Fleet operators, who put thousands of miles on their trucks annually, reported that the B-Series transmissions required more maintenance and occasional rebuild sooner than competing brands. When the trucks were heavily loaded or operated on steep terrain, the problem worsened. Gear oil would heat up quickly, leading to accelerated wear. Dodge engineers knew that the gearbox was not as robust as the rest of the drivetrain, but publicly admitting it would undermine their hard-earned reputation for dependability. Instead, they maintained silence, allowing dealerships to manage complaints individually while continuing to promote the truck as a bulletproof workhorse. The fifth defect Dodge would never openly admit involved the suspension and ride quality, a topic that owners of the time often joked about in private conversations but rarely criticized publicly. The B-Series rode harshly, far harsher than Ford or Chevrolet equivalents. Dodge opted for leaf springs that prioritized load capacity over comfort, but the stiffness of these springs created a punishing experience for drivers traveling on anything other than smooth pavement. Rural owners, farmers, and delivery drivers frequently spent hours driving on uneven dirt roads, and the suspension transmitted every bump, vibration, and pothole directly into the cab. In some regions with poor road conditions, driving a loaded B-Series for a full day could leave a driver physically fatigued, their muscles aching from constant jolts. The light rear end of the truck, especially when unloaded, made the ride even worse. The truck would hop, bounce, and skip across certain road surfaces, making it difficult to maintain traction or directional stability. Passengers, when present, often remarked that the ride felt like sitting on a wooden bench strapped to a moving jackhammer. While modern enthusiasts may consider this normal for old trucks, many drivers of the late 1940s viewed it as a persistent annoyance that Dodge failed to meaningfully address. The company's official stance was that the stiff suspension ensured durability and load capability, and while that was technically true, it came at the cost of driver comfort, something Dodge simply chose not to prioritize in the early post-war years. Many owners improvised solutions, adding weight in the bed to calm down the rear-end bounce, installing aftermarket shocks, or even modifying spring packs. But these measures never fully eliminated the inherent harshness built into the truck's suspension geometry. These 5 defects, overheating tendencies, structural rust vulnerability, vague steering, transmission wear issues, and harsh suspension, formed a hidden reality behind the polished reputation of the Dodge B-Series. They were not flaws that destroyed the truck's legacy, but they added layers of complexity to its history. Dodge's silence about them reveals a truth about the post-war automotive industry. No manufacturer could afford to publicly confess weaknesses at a time when consumer trust was fragile and industrial competition fierce. The B-Series remains a beloved symbol of American grit and post-war optimism, but understanding its hidden imperfections offers a more authentic and human story about what it meant to own and operate one of these iconic machines when it was new. For the people who drove them daily, these defects were part of the experience, sometimes frustrating, sometimes manageable, but always present in the background. While most advertisements from the late 1940s portrayed the Dodge B-Series as a truck engineered with uncompromising toughness, the experience of long-term owners painted a far more nuanced picture. Beyond the initial charm of its post-war styling, beyond the rugged marketing slogans and the patriotic aura surrounding American pickups of the era, there existed a daily reality that owners had to negotiate. It was in this reality that the weaknesses of the B-Series became most apparent, shaping not only how people used the truck but also how mechanics, small business owners, and fleet operators navigated its quirks. One of the strongest examples of this was the constant battle against overheating in regions where high temperatures were a part of everyday life. Many owners developed informal rituals to keep the engine cool, stopping on long hills to let the temperature drop, leaving the hood slightly unlatched during summer work to increase airflow, or swapping the factory thermostat for a cooler-rated one. There were countless stories of drivers carrying extra jugs of water, just in case, treating overheating not as an occasional inconvenience but as a normal part of ownership. Some even removed the hood entirely during harvest season, claiming the truck ran cooler that way. These workarounds became so widespread that they passed into local folklore, discussed casually at feed stores, garages, and cafes, as if they were simply part of the unspoken manual for operating a Dodge B-Series. The cooling issue also had long-term implications on engine longevity. Frequent heat cycling caused premature wear on head gaskets, warped cylinder heads, and weakened water pumps. Mechanics in rural America quickly learned to spot a Dodge truck pulling in with subtle signs of overheating: the slight smell of hot coolant, the ticking sound of metal contracting, the faint steam residue near the radiator cap. Dodge, of course, never admitted that the Flathead 6 was pushed near its limit with the factory cooling system, but the used truck market certainly understood. Trucks that had spent their lives in hot climates often sold for less, with buyers anticipating hidden heat-related wear. This created an interesting divide. B-Series trucks from cooler regions like the northern states often commanded higher prices, not because they were loved more, but because they survived better. The rust issue created a different kind of hidden struggle, one that affected not only owners but also the identity of the truck as it aged. Many early B-Series trucks became what people jokingly called air-conditioned Dodges, because the floors rusted so badly that daylight could be seen through them. In some cases, the cab mounts weakened to the point that the entire cab sat slightly crooked on the frame. Dodge dealerships insisted that these issues were the result of owner neglect or harsh environments, but the truth was embedded in the design itself. Poor drainage, thin metal, and a lack of protective coatings meant that the cab aged faster than the engine or frame. This created the ironic situation where the mechanical components could run reliably for decades while the cab disintegrated around them. Many rural owners resorted to crude but effective repairs: sheet metal screwed directly into the floor, license plates welded over rust holes, or wooden planks used as temporary floor replacement. These fixes were not elegant, but they kept trucks working long past the point where city owners might have retired them. The rust problem also created a generational divide that persists to this day. Older collectors who lived through the truck's early decades often carry a deep respect for anyone who manages to find a B-Series with a solid original cab, because they know just how rare such survivors are. Steering issues, meanwhile, shaped the daily driving experience of the B-Series in ways few modern enthusiasts fully appreciate. The truck required constant attention on the road, and long trips demanded a level of physical and mental endurance that today's drivers might find exhausting. Even when aligned properly, the steering box had an inherent sluggishness that made sudden maneuvers feel imprecise. On rural roads, potholes or ruts could yank the wheel violently, forcing the driver to maintain a firm grip at all times. Delivery drivers often complained that backing the truck into tight alleyways felt like wrestling a stubborn animal. Fleet companies, especially in urban areas, noticed that their drivers reported more fatigue when assigned Dodge trucks compared to competitors. Some companies even altered their routes or loading patterns to reduce steering strain, loading more weight toward the front to help stability, though this sometimes introduced other problems. The heavy steering also had long-term consequences on components. Drivers who continuously fought the wheel put extra stress on the kingpins, leading to faster wear. While Dodge never acknowledged this design flaw publicly, internal service bulletins quietly instructed mechanics on how to tighten steering box tolerances and recommended lubrication intervals more aggressive than the official manual. The gearbox issues also became part of the daily rhythm of owning a B-Series. Many drivers learned to double-clutch out of necessity, not preference, because attempting smooth shifts without it often resulted in grinding gears. The sound of a B-Series climbing through gears became iconic, a combination of whining bearings, stubborn shifts, and the occasional protest of metal on metal when timing wasn't perfect. For some drivers it became part of the truck's personality, but for many it was simply a reminder that the transmission required respect and technique. Long-haul drivers hated these trucks for precisely this reason. The combination of heat, noise, and effort made long routes draining. Fleet mechanics discovered that the transmissions wore out faster when trucks were used for repetitive stop-and-go urban driving, which kept the gearbox in a constant state of stress. Some attempted to mitigate the issue with thicker gear oil or additives, but these only masked symptoms temporarily. Rebuilding a B-Series transmission became a common job for many mid-century mechanics, and some shops even developed improved aftermarket parts that outperformed the original design. Dodge, of course, framed each model year update as progress, but internally they knew that the basic gearbox design had limitations they could not easily redesign without increasing manufacturing costs. The harsh suspension shaped the identity of the B-Series more deeply than any other flaw. The stiffness of the springs, especially in the rear, meant that every road imperfection sent a jolt through the cabin. Drivers became intimately familiar with the sensation of hitting bumps so hard that their teeth rattled or their hats jumped. In some towns, people joked that you could always tell a Dodge truck owner by the way they walked, slow, stiff, and slightly bruised. For farmers, this was simply part of life, but for drivers who used the truck for daily commuting or city deliveries, the rough ride took a toll. Many improvised solutions. Some loaded sandbags or rocks into the bed to improve traction and soften the ride, while others installed aftermarket shocks in hopes of calming the constant bouncing. But no matter the trick, the basic geometry of the suspension meant the truck resisted comfort. The result was a vehicle that functioned brilliantly as a tool but punished its driver endlessly. When Dodge later improved suspension designs in the 1950s, owners of earlier models quickly noticed the difference, and many quietly admitted that the 1948 trucks felt outdated long before their engines wore out. These problems contributed to a complicated used truck market for the B-Series during its first 2 decades. On one hand, the truck's mechanical reputation ensured high demand. On the other hand, buyers were wary of hidden wear. A truck that looked clean might hide a transmission on the verge of failure. A truck with a strong engine might have cab mounts so rusted that repairs would exceed its value. A truck that had lived on a farm might show years of overheating stress hidden behind fresh coolant. Buyers often brought mechanics with them to check for steering play, leaking coolant, weak floors, and whining gears. The folklore surrounding the B-Series grew, and many myths arose about how to judge a truck's true condition. Some believed you could tell how badly a B-Series had been overheated by listening for a particular ticking noise. Others insisted that the steering wheel's free play was the most important measurement. Still others claimed that if the floor pans had already been replaced, the rest of the cab was likely compromised. These were not myths born from exaggeration but from collective experience passed from one generation to the next. As decades passed, these defects became part of the B-Series story. Enthusiasts today often restore these trucks with full awareness of the original weaknesses, and they go to great lengths to fix what Dodge never properly addressed. Oversized radiators, modern water pumps, electronic fans, rust-resistant replacement floor panels, upgraded steering boxes, improved suspension components, and synchronized transmissions have all become part of the restorer's toolkit. The irony is that modern restorations often create a version of the truck that is better engineered than anything Dodge built in 1948. Purists may argue that such upgrades betray the truck's authenticity, but many owners simply want a truck that looks vintage while driving more comfortably and reliably than the original ever could. This tendency reflects the underlying truth: the Dodge B-Series was loved not because it was perfect, but because it was honest in its imperfections. People formed relationships with these trucks not in spite of their flaws but because living with them required patience, adaptation, and ingenuity. Despite everything, the B-Series carved a legacy of resilience and loyalty. Owners forgave its flaws because the truck never pretended to be something it wasn't. It was a work machine built in a moment of American transition, a bridge between wartime austerity and post-war prosperity. The defects that Dodge never publicly admitted became part of the narrative that makes the truck historically fascinating today. They reveal the limitations of the era's engineering, the pressures of rapid industrial retooling, and the gap between marketing promises and mechanical reality. They remind us that behind every classic vehicle adored by collectors lies a history of real people who struggled with real problems, who modified, repaired, and coaxed those machines through decades of service. In the end, the 1948 Dodge B-Series remains an icon not because it was flawless, but because it represents an era when machines were built with raw honesty. Its weaknesses tell a story every bit as rich as its strengths. And in a world where modern vehicles hide their imperfections behind layers of electronics, the B-Series stands as a reminder of a time when a truck demanded respect from its driver, punished carelessness, rewarded skill, and never hid its true nature, except, of course, for the few defects the factory preferred to leave out of the brochure.